And joining us now on the debate, in Calgary, Alberta, Bob Bergen, professor at the Centre for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. In the nation's capital, Roland Martin, research chair in international security and governance at the University of Ottawa. In Kingston, Ontario, Doug Bland, chair in defense management studies at Queen's University. And here in studio, retired Colonel Brian MacDonald, senior defense analyst at the Conference of Defense Associations, and Janice Stein, TVO's own foreign affairs analyst and director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. And as I welcome everybody both here in studio and in Points Beyond to our discussion tonight, I want to remind everybody that we're basically going to talk about two things today. We want to get a state of the Canadian military after having spent 10 years almost in Afghanistan, and understand what the condition of our troops and our military means in terms of looking forward to whatever our next future engagement might be. So to that end, I want to read this, and Michael, if you would, put this up. From Campbell Clark of the Globe and Mail. Afghanistan has been a tough war. The 152 fallen Canadian soldiers, billions spent, years of seemingly fruitless attempts to displace the Taliban, and the gnawing sense Afghans' lives have not improved. When the troops come home next summer, most Canadians would be happy if it marks the end of nasty foreign military adventures. Canada's military will leave Afghanistan with a bitter taste in its mouth about the scope and scale of what it can accomplish. But it has evolved into something in critical short supply, a force that can deliver a few thousand troops able to help lash together multinational contingents and confront the low-tech insurgencies, warlords, and rebel groups that are the new, vexing face of conflict in the world. Let's go around the table on this one. You just got back from the Halifax Security Forum in Halifax this past weekend, where I gather this was a subject of conversation. So generally speaking, after a decade in Afghanistan, how's our military? You know, it certainly was a subject of conversation, Steve, and that's an accurate representation, clearly, of our Army. This is a battle-honed group that can move quickly, far more quickly than it could before the war started, operates on the ground, and has most of the equipment that it actually needs in these kinds of operations. That having been said, you know, from the Chief of Defense Staff on down, who is, you know, extraordinarily proud of what our Army has been able to do on the ground, also recognizes what a challenge this kind of combat is, how difficult it is to know when you're winning and when you're not, and is open to new ways of fighting and new ways of engaging, which might require different kinds of capability going forward. Absolutely. Bob Bergen, how would you answer the question?
Well, I would disagree with some of the fundamental assumptions that it was made there, and that Afghans' lives haven't improved, because having been there, I saw Afghans' lives who told me that their lives had improved and things had improved.
Thanks to the Canadian military?
No, ordinary Afghans.
No, I'm saying thanks to the Canadian military, their lives had improved?
Thanks to the Canadian military and thanks to NATO. I mean, don't forget, it's not just Canada that's in there. There's 28 other NATO nations and dozens others. So I think that the perspective is lost there. It's a much bigger operation than just the Canadians who died there. I mean, and the idea that it's a failure and a failed war, I think, is fundamentally wrong.
Okay, for what it's worth, Professor Bergen, I'm going to make sure we don't get off track here and debate whether or not Afghanistan was right or wrong, or should we have gone, all that. We want a state of the military today as a result of being there. And Doug Bland, I'll ask you to pick up on that. What's the condition our military is in today, 2010, having spent almost a decade in Afghanistan?
I think it's fair to say, and soldiers will tell you that, and some senior officers I was speaking to just this morning will say that the Army especially is tired. You can see it in somewhat subtle ways with the resignation of middle-ranking officers and NCOs. They're the tired people in the system. Other parts of the armed forces, the Navy and some parts of the Air Force aren't facing the same kind of stress and strains. But it's interesting, I think, in this conversation to not separate the armed forces from Canadian society. The people who are really tired of this war and have no staying power, perhaps, are Canadian leaders and politicians, and in some respects, the bureaucrats in Ottawa who work with them. This is a long, dragged-out confrontation, and I've written elsewhere that because there's no political partisan benefits to Canadian politicians, this might very well be our last war.
Roland Paris, how would you answer it?
Well, I think that we're ending up with a tired force, but a highly trained and extremely flexible force. And I think that it's worth underlining that they've acquired this flexibility because of the difficulty of the environment that they've been operating in. And in some ways, that is an important legacy of Afghanistan, because even if we end up leaving a few hundred troops in Afghanistan to do a training mission, we will have now access to a much larger force, expeditionary force, which could, if we chose to do so, be deployed into other parts of the world, not necessarily in the same large contingent, but maybe in smaller contingents where there's a need and where we make a collective decision to do so. And that in itself is a good thing, because all of our eggs have been in the Afghanistan basket for many years, and we've seen some of the diplomatic consequences recently of being hyper-focused on just one mission.
Colonel MacDonald, what shapes our military in now?
From the standpoint of experience, now we have an Army that, and a good portion of the Air Force as well, which now has war experience and knows how to handle things. And we haven't been in that position since the time of the Korean War. And indeed, the Army, particularly, as I joined the Army in the late 50s, early 60s, we still had people with World War II and Korean ribbons on that at that point. And they then had the bulk of the experience of combat, which then could be fed through to younger officers like those around me. And we're now in this situation. We've got a whole bunch of young people, young officers, young NCOs, who now have war experience. And as they move, as their careers move through, they will be the backbone of the forces, and they will bring that experience to bear on a variety of the choices that have to be made in terms, for example, of the equipment, in terms of the particular approach that you take to operations. So in that sense, we have a quantum leap in terms of that type of capacity of the forces. Now, we've got tired equipment because, of course, it's been beat up something fierce. But again, the government has been launching into programs of rehabilitating those pieces of equipment, buying new pieces of equipment, as they have continued to do through the entirety of the operation. So it's not all bad at all. It's a lot of good stuff in the long term for us.
Bob Bergen, let me get you to follow up on that. It is true we now have battle-tested and battle-experienced troops that we didn't have 10 years ago. Do you agree with some, though, who say that those troops are now tired?
Well, I know for a fact that they're tired. I know the Strathconas, who have been there constantly with the tanks since they went over there, are now deploying 2 squadrons there next year in 2011, and those guys are just beat. The infantry, I know, is tired. The reservists are tired. I know the reservists who have been over there many times, and it's caused a drain on their families, their jobs. But on the same time, I agree with Brian that, their experience and what they can pass along to the next generation of reservists, I think, is invaluable. I think our troops are in the best shape they've been in from a combat experience since the Korean War. I agree with all of that.
Let me follow up with you, Janice. I mean, clearly, the polls will tell you that there's a good chunk of the Canadian public that's tired of this war.
Yes.
The Canadian political leadership in this country, which has had enough of this war. We're now hearing that a lot of the troops and the reservists have had enough of this war. Is that where we're at now?
No, I don't think that's what we're hearing, by the way, that the troops have had enough of the war. I think it's one thing to say they're tired, which many of them are, because the rotation schedule has been really intense and not enough time back home. That doesn't mean they've had enough of the war. Actually, when you talk to these guys on the ground, that's not what they tell you, that they've had enough.
They still went to make a difference.
They went to make a difference, and they
sure.
are still going. I mean, some of them are still going it again now to make a difference. So that's a subtle point, but it really matters in terms of the spirit of the Army. I think the bigger question is the going forward question that you asked, Steve. When the battle group comes home next summer from Afghanistan, and we will leave a significant number of forces in Afghanistan, that's clear. That decision has already been made.
You know what the number is?
There's a debate about the actual numbers. It was happening all around me this weekend, and there's a debate about exactly how we're going to define training, but it's significant. But that having been said, the real question is, are we going to fight the next war, the next kind of insurgency, in the way we fought this one?
Well, hold off on that, because that's the second half of our debate.
It's not clear that we will.
Right, I'm not going there yet, but I want to follow up with Doug Bland on this one. Andrew Leslie, head of the Army.
Head of the Army Transformational Task
Force. Thank you, Professor Stein. There was this report from DND, Department of National Defense, that got leaked saying the, quote, General Leslie saying the Afghanistan mission is particularly taxing on Army capabilities and the current operations tempo is not sustainable. Do you agree with his assessment?
I think yeah, of course, I wouldn't dare disagree with Andy Leslie.
You're allowed to.
But yeah, I am now, yeah. No, seriously, it is difficult. And people are enthusiastic, you know, especially the young guys, for what they're doing, for the most part. But their families aren't. And certainly the older NCOs and officers in the business, they're tired too. And that affects their combat capabilities. We need to understand that when we start talking about, as Brian was a few minutes ago, about the early 1960s and so on, and the experience we had in the Armed Forces of Canada in those years was 125,000 people. These are very big units. What we have now is a very small army. If politicians had been responsible at the beginning of this operation, especially when we went into the southern battle zone, we would have started some form of mobilization, rapid expansion, rapid training of Army units and combat units to provide the relief that was needed in line. But that takes money, and what we're talking about in Canada now and what's the Army going to do next is all predicated on one fact. The governments provide what's available for national defense, not what's needed for national defense. So what that means is, what are you going to be able to do with less than 2% of GDP as a defense budget year in, year out into the future? And you're not going to be able to do a lot when 50% of that money goes to people.
No, I do get that, and we are going to get there, but I want to follow up with Colonel MacDonald on this angle, though. Given a decade in Afghanistan, obviously our troops were trained for and learned to do new things. What can we now do after 10 years there that, say, 10 years ago we couldn't do?
Well, you can look at the type of equipment that we have. 10 years ago, we did not have any medium transport helicopters. So as a consequence, you couldn't pick up a 777 howitzer and helicopter it out to a new fire base and then helicopter all of its bullets in support. We can do that now. We have rented some, or bought some helicopters from the Americans, but we have then ordered the brand new medium transport helicopters. 10 years ago, we didn't have strategic airlift. And now we have 4 of the big C-17s, which have been just workhorses. We should have bought 6, not 4. And it goes on like that. We have increased as we have experienced the process on the ground. We have learned that we have to add new pieces of kit to the mix to maximize the impact. We've also relearned the fact that combined arms means that you need to have medium artillery and you need to have main battle tanks in order for the infantry to be protected and to be able to be escorted through to do the job that it does.
Okay, having said that, Roland Paris, let me get you to comment on something that Brian Stewart of the CBC said. This was many years ago that he said this, and you tell me what it's like today. The current situation, in turn, is made more serious by the military's deficit in highly skilled technicians, who in many cases are simply not available, at least to be recruited into wartime military. To fill gaps on the ground, hundreds of sailors and air personnel have been plucked from ships and airfields to take on infantry duties in Kandahar. I should have said many months ago, not many years ago. In any event, okay, what do you think of that analysis?
Honestly, I don't know what the situation is with technicians in the Canadian Forces. I could tell you that what I have seen in Afghanistan when I've gone and looked at the operations of the Canadian Forces is that they have a range of technical support, including Canadian Forces personnel and hired contractors. So I'm not sure if that's a big gap. I think that coming back to the question about what Canadian Forces can do now, what they couldn't do before, or what they couldn't do before, one of the critical issues beyond the acquisition of equipment is the fact that they've been involved in the equivalent of a decade-long intensive training mission. I mean, it is actual combat, actual operations in a very insecure and challenging environment. So as a result, we have a highly trained and highly capable force. The human capital in the force is very high, and that's very good news, because I would suggest to you we do not know what the Canadian forces are going to do next. It's very difficult for us to talk about what kind of adjustments to counterinsurgency strategy there might be. Frankly, we're always fighting the last war. If there's anything predictable, it's that it's going to be something different, and having flexible forces is probably the greatest asset and greatest legacy of this Afghan mission for the forces.
Janice, a follow-up?
Yeah, you know, just to add what Roland said, you know, the significant difference in our forces is they move quickly. We have mobility. When we started this a decade ago, we had no mobility, and that's a huge difference. So we can actually deploy our forces. We can put them in relatively quickly. We could not do that a decade ago. You talked about, Brian talked about the technician problem, and it is an issue, right? It's a support, which they did cannibalize from the other joint. But one of the things that we talked about all weekend, and it came from the Americans, from some of the Europeans, as well as from our people, the big gap that we still haven't closed yet are the civilians that we need to go in these kinds of counterinsurgency operations. Everybody recognized that we cannot yet put on the ground enough civilians to do the development work. To actually on the ground, once you know, it's the hold piece. You can take, but we still can't hold, because it's difficult, really hard to get civilians to deploy over time for this kind of work. And that's a gap not only that we face, but that all governments face.
Bob Bergen, does the Army now, after 10 years in Afghanistan, have the kind of equipment it would need to engage in a similar conflict going forward?
Well, I can't think of another similar conflict right yet, but I can say something about the equipment, and that is, you might remember that early on in Rick Hillier's position as Chief of Defense Staff, he called tanks a millstone around the neck of the Army, and he wanted to get rid of him in his transformation. And in fact, he was wrong about that, because they ended up needing tanks, and they ended up taking the tanks to Afghanistan and learning that they needed that kind of equipment in that environment, and getting the infantry comfortable working around tanks. And that is a legacy that I think, and a lesson that ought to be learned, is we need to have this kind of equipment available for any future mission. And the second thing I would talk about and pick up on is learning how to train. When you see the Canadian Maneuver Training Center at CFB Wainwright, they've built actual Afghan villages that these soldiers train in. And what it reminded me of was the rehearsals for Vimy Ridge, where they created Vimy Ridge and then went through the steps so they could do a rolling barrage and actually move forward. They're actually training like they have to fight, and I think that's a lesson that they will move forward with in whatever future conflict it's going to be, is they know how to train now. Okay, Doug Glenn, we talked about the Army. Let's talk about the Navy. What's its status today?
The Navy is in very rough shape. Its ships are old, and especially its destroyers are practically finished. It has two support ships. You know, you call them the 7-11 ships. They carry all the gas and fuel and medical supplies and stuff for the Navy when they're at sea. These ships are 40 years old or more, steam-driven ships. They are operating under special licenses from the international community because they are single-hulled ships that in law are not allowed to carry fuels into oceans. So the frigates are better, but they are time-worn as well. But the big problem is that despite all the announcements about shipbuilding strategies by all the governments over numbers of years, Canada does not have a shipbuilding strategy. It doesn't have a ship procurement strategy. There is nothing behind the front of the store except the ships that you see. While the frigates are being upgraded or refitted right now, the fact is that we will have no operational Navy in our coastal waters in 10, 15 years unless we start building ships almost immediately, and they're not doing that.
Well, let me follow up. You're not too far away from the nation's capital there. Do you think there is the will in Ottawa to find the money to replace, for example, those destroyers that need replacing?
Well, there's lots of talk about it, and there's lots of will, and as I said, every government's talked about having a shipbuilding strategy. We had a conference here a few months ago, and it was hard to get anybody from Ottawa to come down and even talk about it. The fact is that the defense budget is falling, it's not rising. The fact that we have managed to build a very capable small army doesn't mean that we should be running around or even contemplating sending the army someplace to do things. It's much too expensive. What we need to think about now is that we have two strategic imperatives in this country. That's the defense of Canada, and the second is the defense of North America in cooperation with the United States. Canada, in my view, is now a Western Hemispheric nation, not just a North Atlantic nation. And as Janice and other people have emphasized, there's 100 million Mexicans living south of us. There's a whole continent south of us. There are wars going on in Mexico and other parts of the world. We need to refocus into our own hemisphere, and that requires an armed force built around the Navy, not the Army.
Okay, we've talked Army, Navy. Colonel MacDonald, I want to go to you with the Air Force. You know, there's been a ton of coverage lately about the F-35s and whether or not this is the right jet for the right time and the right purchase and all of that. Setting all of the controversies about the procurement process aside, is this the right plane for us?
We are in a position right now of going between what are called fourth-generation fighters and fifth-generation fighters. And to describe the difference, try one word, called stealth. Now, about 3 years ago, I was out at Elbendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, the American base, shortly after they had stood up their F-22 squadron. The F-22 is a stealth fighter. And they ran an exercise.
Stealth meaning you can't see it on radar.
Stealth means it's hard to see.
Hard to see on radar.
And when they ran the exercise, they involved a squadron of F-22s against the resident squadron of F-15s. And at the end of it, as one of the American pilots told me, the F-15 pilots announced that they didn't want to play anymore because they couldn't find the F-22s and the F-22s could find them. A separate document from an Australian indicates that the score was 144 for the F-22s, 0 for the F-15s. So and the F-15s have been the leading edge of combat aircraft.
So you're saying we should be buying 22s instead
of 35s?
Well,
quite frankly, I would prefer to see the RCAF with F-22s rather than the F-35s. But given that the Americans are not going to sell F-22s, they're going to keep that capability to themselves, then we need an aircraft that has got a stealth capability. And if we're not going to buy stealth capability, then we're going to see our pilots being shot out of the air.
Does the F-35 have stealth capability?
It has stealth capability.
As good as the 22?
I don't think it's as good as the 22, but I don't know because I haven't seen any analysis that compares them directly.
Okay, Janice?
You know, so if you actually listen to the
analysis by the Australians.
Let me get Bob first and then Janice on this. Okay, go ahead, Bob Bergen.
Yes, I've seen analysis by the Australians who are in the same predicament we are in terms of buying the F-35s with no debate about whether or not that's the right plane and a sole source contract. And I think that there's a much larger debate here, and it's what are those airplanes for? Are they for air sovereignty over Canada, or precisely what are they for? And the evaluation that the Australian came up with said that the F-35s are not the airplane that the Raptor is, and that the Russians are coming up with the second prototype of the Su-35S flanker, which it's a fourth generation fighter, which is far capable than any other jet fighter in the Western arsenal, other than the Raptor, the 22. So regardless of whether Canada gets the 35, it doesn't matter because the Soviets are coming up with a far superior airplane. We are not going to be able to get the 22. So there's a much larger question there of who's going to defend the airspace if it isn't the 15s or the 35s rather. And that isn't even contemplating about the Soviets developing the stealth Pack FA, which is comparable to the Raptor. So
I know, Bob Bergen, you didn't mean to call them the Soviets. You mean the Russians.
Yeah.
I know.
The
Russians.
So the fact of the matter is that regardless of what plane, if we get the 35, the flankers and the packs are going to be able to fly with impunity in American airspace and Canadian airspace. The question is, will they? And the answer is, of course they will. Just like the Americans flew their spy planes over Russia, you know, the U-2s and the Blackbirds, just because they could, and there was nothing the Soviets could do about it.
You know, we've actually hit on the core of the debate here. You listen to Doug and to Bob, And you can always make a case for a particular piece of equipment, right? And you can make the case, by the way, is this the best? Is this the state of the art? And the discussion we just heard is that. There's a bigger issue here. The defense budget is declining in real dollars, as Doug said. Nobody thinks that we can be state of the art in the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army.
Got to pick.
We've got to pick. We've been down this road before. We had years of a nonsense debate called combat capable across the spectrum. Nobody really believed it, but everybody talked about it. We actually made the decisions were made for us a decade ago when we invested very, very heavily in the Army. Frankly, there's no way going forward that we will meet Doug's requirements for the Navy, and we can buy the F-35, and we can keep the Army at a state of readiness of the kind we're
vigorously
talking
nodding
about.
his head.
We have to get serious here.
Roland, why are you vigorously nodding
well,
your head
because
on
I'm
that?
politely trying to get in without interrupting Janice. But I agree entirely. And there's no way that we're going to be able to afford all of this.
No.
One of the changes from the Afghan mission is that the armed forces are no longer going to be at the head of the queue when it comes to calling on increasingly scarce resources. It's going to be back to normal politics for procurement. But I have to say that one of my concerns about the debate that we've been having thus far in this country about the F-35 and the Navy, et cetera, is that it's been driven first by the consideration of what the equipment is, and not first by consideration of what the primary missions are that we want our military, which is an instrument of national policy, to be accomplishing. There's a similar problem in the debate that we've been having about deployment of Canadian forces that might be possible in the future, where we've been talking about, is it Congo, is it Haiti? Whereas what we should really be talking about, I think, is what are the questions we should ask ourselves every single time we face the possibility of a deployment. So there are key political considerations underlying all of these military policy issues, and especially in the case of the equipment, I am struck by the kind of fetishization of the kit at the expense of the key political decisions about what our priorities should be.
Let me
Steve,
get Doug Blend on that. Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, can I join in that?
Please.
The most expensive part of the defense budget are people.
50%.
People budget eats more than 50% of the budget. The maintenance of a lot of useless bases across Canada, other infrastructure costs, operational costs, eats another 35 or maybe 40%. What's left over, and it's always just what's left over, gets spent for new equipment. If you want to reduce or to have more money for equipment, what you need to do is find ways to create combat capability with fewer people and to close down redundant bases. Now, the question, and Roland is right, and we all, people who are political scientists and others, always say, well, what are the goals? What is the national interest? How are we going to do this? And then we'll figure out how much to spend and what missions to undertake to meet those goals. We don't do that in Canada. In Canada, there is no threat, and if there was one, the Americans will save us. That's our stand to defense policy. What we do, what we need to ask is what can we do with 2% GDP, if you're lucky, to produce a somewhat capable force that can work in Canada and defend North America.
All right, let me get Brian MacDonald in here on this then. We've heard what the state of our forces is. We have heard what the state of our equipment is. We know that our combat mission in Afghanistan is coming to an end very soon. So given all of that we have discussed so far, we are now prepared for what?
Well, I'm not sure that we know what we're prepared for, because if you go back historically and look at what people were thinking at any given time and what actually took place within the time frame that they were planning for,
it didn't match up hardly at all. You know, again, we talk about war and peace, you know, the First World War, the war to end wars, and then 20 years later we were back into an even more vicious one, and then 5 years after that ended, we're into the Korean War. But Roland's saying right now we have a situation where we've got the tail, or I can't remember, it was Doug who was saying it, we've got the tail wagging the dog. Our next choice for our next military engagement will not be determined by political imperatives, but rather by whatever equipment we happen to be able to have.
That's not true.
Well, you say it's not true, but that's what people are discussing.
Well, actually, that's not true. You know, there's a middle ground here. There isn't this ideal exercise where you sit down and you say, what are the strategic objectives? What's the threat? We should do it that way. We don't, because we're just imperfect human beings. What is driven by, and is, though, by the political environment, what our allies want us to do. Who's putting pressure on us to do something? And we do this in partnership with others. So here's where I actually disagree with Brian. We actually got it quite right over the last 20 years. We haven't taken seriously the threat of, fighters coming over the horizon from Russia and attacking North America.
Because we outsourced that to the United States, right?
Not only that, the United States doesn't take that seriously anymore. That's not high on their strategic list of threats. So roughly, we've gotten the threats right. We do need a capacity to survey and patrol our skies. Our biggest issue, frankly, in air defense, hijacked jets. That's something that all of North America is. What do you need to defend against that? The kinds of operational deployments we've had in Afghanistan, you may like to think it's our last war and some very tired families and tired publics, but history shows no, it won't be.
Well, let me try this with Roland then. Do we? I mean, I guess one of the key questions at this point is, do we go next where we're needed, or do we go next where whatever equipment we have allows us to go?
I wouldn't frame it in terms of the equipment driving deployment decisions. What I was saying before is that our discussion about what the future of Canadian defense policy post-Afghanistan should be has been largely focused on the technical capability of particular weapons packages rather than the broader discussion of what our priorities should be. And I agree with Janice, there's never going to be a perfect political process, but at the very least we can try and contribute some of that first principles thinking. In terms of decisions about next deployments, everybody has their own conception of how that should be determined, but my own view is that there is essentially three questions to ask if there are opportunities for us to consider deployment. The first is whether it's important, and it may be important for strategic or humanitarian reasons. The second is whether there is a need for the kind of thing that Canada can provide, and our equipment is part of that calculation, and also what our allies are doing. And the third is there a plan to end the mission? And I would put it to you that we didn't go through that kind of questioning when we decided to send our battle group to Kandahar, and I certainly hope that we do, should we be faced with a similar situation.
Let me get Bob Bergen on that. Is our next engagement going to be more dependent on the political needs or our strategic needs, our national security interests, or more likely what equipment we have and where we can physically get to?
Well, I have 2 points to make here, and I agree that we have to determine what our national interests are and what is good strategically for Canada. But at the same point, look at the 1999 Kosovo Air War and the crisis in Kosovo. Canada committed CF-18s to that NATO mission, and we dropped 500,000 pounds of bombs there, and nobody knows about that. So what having those kind of aircraft and potentially in the future the F-35s will allow us to make a contribution to NATO or the United Nations or in some fashion with our key American ally. So that kind of mission would be driven by the equipment. Having said that, it is always a politician that makes the decision. The other point I want to make here is that when they were talking, Doug was talking about closing bases and what unneeded bases. The last time that was done, it was done in a very political manner and not done from the domestic needs of Canada. And they moved the engineers squadron from Chilliwack to Edmonton, Alberta, and there is no engineers in Alberta that can, or east of the rest of the Rockies rather, that can possibly deal with a catastrophic earthquake. And it's not a question of if a catastrophic earthquake is going to come, it's only a question of when. And the Canadian forces are not equipped to deal with that, precisely because they consolidated bases in Edmonton.
Okay, and Bob, forgive me. I'm going to jump in here.
They need to rethink that decision.
I'm going to jump in, Bob, forgive me, because we're down to our last couple of minutes and we need to consider this question. Has Afghanistan, Colonel MacDonald, fundamentally altered the kind of mission Canada can now embark on?
I think that it has given us a range of missions from a more intense form, as the case in Afghanistan, down through all the range of lesser missions back to classical blue helmet peacekeeping, where you have a truce that you're monitoring. Because of the additions to the capabilities, we can do the range, whereas before we couldn't.
So we're better in that respect.
We're better in that sense.
In that sense.
There's no question that the mission has altered our capability. But you asked the question, Steve, what's the next mission? We already made that decision.
What is it?
We just made it this weekend. A chunk of Canadian armed capability is going to stay in Afghanistan. We've essentially said the combat group is coming out, but a chunk of our soldiers are staying. Why do we do that? Our allies asked us to do it. That is a repeated story in Canadian defense policy, and it will happen over and over and over again.
Not combat though, right? You're talking about training Afghan forces and so on.
It depends what kind of training missions we do, but some training missions require our soldiers to be embedded in combat missions that go out.
Okay, that's the last word on this one. Can I thank our guests all out of town? Bob Bergen at the University of Calgary, Roland Paris, University of Ottawa, Doug Bland at Queen's University. It's good having all three of you on the program, out of town and points beyond for us. Here in the studio, Colonel Brian MacDonald from the Conference of Defense Associations, and of course our own Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs. Thanks so much for this conversation, everyone.
You're very welcome.